All right, let's dive in. Today we're looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through a pretty interesting lens. We've got Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, so, definitely a perspective to consider.
Absolutely.
And he's got some really surprising historical stuff in here. But, we want to look at this through kind of the lens of international law and human rights and what it all means for Palestinian self-determination.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, just going beyond just understanding Netanyahu and actually challenging some of the core assumptions.
Yeah. So like right off the bat, he kind of goes deep into history. And he's making this argument that, Jewish claims to the land go way back, further back even than Palestinian claims. And he's got all these examples like these Jewish communities under Roman rule, Byzantine rule, continuous living in like Pekian and Shafam.
Right.
He even brings up how like Israeli coins today use these old Jewish coin designs.
That's interesting.
It's a very compelling narrative.
Yeah, but you have to wonder, how much does a historical narrative hold up with like modern international law?
Yeah.
When you have to consider things like colonialism, displacement, modern nation states, all that.
That's the thing, right? It's not as simple as like we were here first.
Exactly.
Then you got like the Balfour Declaration, which, promised a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And then you got UN Resolution 242, which said Israel had to withdraw from the territories.
Yeah, these are like key legal milestones that directly impact this conflict. I mean, the Balfour Declaration, it's super important, but it didn't actually grant, full sovereignty.
Oh, interesting.
And it also really emphasized protecting the rights of non-Jewish communities in Palestine. And UN Resolution 242, people use it in peace negotiations all the time. But it's actually really vague, open to a lot of interpretations.
So it almost sounds like Netanyahu is picking and choosing parts of history that support his case. But how strong is that case when you look at international law?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, emphasizing historical claims like that, it's emotionally powerful, but it might not really stand up to international legal frameworks. These things are complicated, right? Like, history and law don't always agree, especially when you got multiple people claiming the same land. So, got to think about that as we go through Netanyahu's arguments.
Yeah, definitely got to keep those legal complexities in mind.
For sure.
Now, another thing that gets kind of controversial is when he talks about human rights. And what he calls the Palestinian problem. He basically says a lot of the violence in the Middle East comes from what he calls like a deep-seated Arab culture of violence. And he basically dismisses all the concerns about human rights violations as just propaganda.
Well, I think we got to be careful there. I mean, when you look at what's been documented about human rights in the occupied territories, it's not just propaganda. You've got to look at things like the intifadas, the impact of Israeli settlements on Palestinian communities. I mean, the real challenge here is how do you maintain security, but also respect everybody's human rights? It's tough, and it needs a more nuanced approach than what Netanyahu's giving.
Yeah, and he does bring up some examples, though, like the 1929 Hebron massacre.
He does.
Which was just horrible.
Yeah, a terrible event. But, just because something tragic happened in the past doesn't mean we can ignore what's happening now. He also talked about the Palestinian right of return.
The idea that refugees can go back to their old homes.
Exactly. He frames it as like an attack on Jewish return. He even compares Palestinians throwing stones to assault with intent to murder.
Those are some pretty strong comparisons.
Yeah, and it's meant to shock.
Yeah.
But I think framing it that way, he avoids the real issues. The reasons why Palestinians are so frustrated and why they resist.
Yeah.
It's like he's trying to distract us from the real human rights problems they face every day.
So it's like he's showing us a very specific picture.
Yeah.
But maybe not the whole picture.
I think that's fair to say, yeah. I mean, he leaves out a lot about the Palestinian experience, the displacement, the restrictions on movement, not having enough resources. These are basic human rights, and we need to talk about them.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we're going to have a real conversation about peace.
Okay, so much to think about already, and we've only just scratched the surface of this book.
Yeah, we've got a lot more to cover. Sounds good.
It could be interesting, for sure.
Definitely. So we were talking about Netanyahu's views on human rights.
Yeah, and it seems like there's a lot more to say there.
Oh, definitely.
But let's move on to something else that's been a big part of this whole conflict.
Okay.
The idea of a two-state solution. Netanyahu doesn't seem too keen on that.
No, he's pretty consistently against a Palestinian state in the West Bank.
Why is that?
His main reason is security.
Okay.
He says the PLO's goal is to destroy Israel, and a Palestinian state would just make that easier.
He uses a lot of historical examples to back that up, right?
He does, yeah. He talks about this thing called the phased plan.
Okay.
Supposedly a PLO strategy to take Palestine step by step. He also mentions a secret map presented to the U.S.
A secret map, huh?
Yeah, and then he compares it to giving Hitler the Sudetenland.
Wow, so, like, appeasing Hitler would be like giving the Palestinians a state.
Exactly, that's his point.
That's a pretty loaded comparison.
It is.
But even putting that aside, wouldn't a two-state solution be like...
Yeah.
In line with self-determination?
It would, and that's a big deal in international law.
Right, the right to govern yourself.
Exactly.
So the question is, can you have both?
That's the million-dollar question. Can Palestinian self-determination and Israeli security work together?
And if so, how?
Exactly, and I think we need to look beyond Netanyahu's perspective here.
Okay.
He kind of presents it as black and white, right?
Yeah.
Like, either Israel has total control for security,
right,
or they give in and risk being destroyed.
Right. No middle ground.
But maybe it's not that simple.
So you're saying there could be a way to meet both needs?
Yeah, both Israeli security and Palestinian self-governance.
Okay, so how do you do that?
Well, Netanyahu doesn't really talk about things like,
Yeah.
Working together on security or phasing things.
Right, like a gradual transition.
Right, and there are models from other conflicts that we could learn from.
So he might be right to worry about security.
Yeah.
But he's dismissing the possibility of finding a solution that works for both sides.
I think so, yeah. He's not being very flexible or creative.
Okay, so we've talked about history, international law, human rights. What does he actually propose as a solution?
Okay, so this is interesting. He doesn't focus on land for peace. Instead, he thinks there are two main ways to get peace.
Okay, what are they?
Promoting democracy and using deterrence.
Okay, so first, democracy.
Yeah, he says democratic countries are less likely to go to war.
Why is that?
Because leaders have to answer to their people.
Makes sense. People usually don't want war.
Right. Democracies have checks and balances against going to war.
Okay, but what about countries that aren't democracies?
That's where deterrence comes in.
Okay, so how does that work?
He says if tyrannical leaders know they'll face serious consequences, like losing power, territory, even their lives.
Right, so they'll think twice about starting a war.
Exactly. The cost of war has to be higher than the benefits.
He uses a historical example to show this, right?
He does. He talks about Hitler.
Okay.
He says the West was too weak, didn't stand up to Hitler early on.
Right, appeasement.
Yeah, and that led to World War II.
So his point is, if you look weak, you invite aggression.
Exactly, and he applies this to the Middle East, too.
Okay.
He thinks pressuring Israel to make concessions will just make things worse.
If the Arab world doesn't do the same, right?
Right. He thinks Israel needs to be strong.
Okay, so a strong military is key for him.
Yes, he sees it as essential for Israel's security.
But even a strong country needs allies, right?
He agrees. He talks a lot about the importance of alliances.
Especially with the U.S.?
Yeah, he dedicates a big chunk of his book to that.
And how does he see that relationship?
Is it just about shared interests, or is there something more?
Yeah.
He says it's deeper than just strategy. It's about shared values.
Okay.
Like democracy, freedom, human rights. He thinks Americans see themselves in Israel.
That's a pretty idealistic view.
It is, but he also knows that public opinion matters.
For maintaining that alliance.
Yeah, he criticizes Israel for not doing enough to win people over.
Interesting.
He says they've focused too much on military stuff and not enough on public diplomacy.
So what does he think they should do?
He wants them to be more active, engage with the media,
okay,
fight back against negative portrayals of Israel.
Highlight the good stuff.
Exactly.
So not just sitting back and hoping for the best.
No, actively shaping the conversation.
Especially in the U.S.
Yeah, where public opinion influences policy a lot.
So winning hearts and minds.
That's what he thinks is needed.
Interesting approach. So it sounds like he's really focused on narrative and perception.
He is. He thinks stories shape reality.
Yeah.
And Israel needs to be better at telling its story.
It's definitely a different way of thinking about peace building.
It is.
But what about the economic side of things?
Does he talk about that at all?
Yeah?
He does. He wants Israel to be less reliant on U.S. aid.
Okay.
And focus more on getting American investment.
So not just handouts, but becoming a real economic partner?
Exactly. He wants Israel to be a global economic force.
Okay.
Strengthening ties with the U.S. and other countries.
That makes sense. What about the rise of groups like ISIS?
Does he talk about that?
Yeah, and the spread of radical Islam.
He sees that as a huge threat.
To Israel.
To Israel and to the world.
So what does he say about it?
He wants a strong stance against them and more international cooperation to fight it.
Where does Israel fit into that, according to him?
He thinks Israel has a unique perspective and valuable skills.
From dealing with these kinds of threats.
Exactly. He wants closer cooperation with the U.S. and other allies.
To share intel and stuff.
Yeah, basically he sees Israel as being on the front lines.
With a lot of experience to offer.
Right, and he says Israel's security is tied to global security.
So everyone benefits from a stable Middle East.
That's his argument.
It sounds like he ultimately sees Israel as a force for good.
Yeah, he thinks their values, innovation, commitment to democracy make them important.
In a complicated world.
Exactly.
Okay, we've covered a lot.
We have.
But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
His use of historical parallels.
Oh, yeah.
He does that a lot.
He does. It's kind of a recurring theme.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Well, he talks about the Jewish people's history of resilience.
Okay.
Like fighting to survive against all odds.
Right.
He brings up stories like the Maccabees.
Fighting for independence.
Yeah, against the Seleucid Empire.
Right.
And even the Jewish revolt against Rome.
Which they didn't win.
No, but it showed their spirit of resistance.
And he connects that to Israel today.
Exactly, like a direct line from the past to the present.
It's a strong way to make his point.
It is. It creates this sense of continuity.
Yeah.
Like Israel has always had to fight for its existence.
It's a powerful message.
It is, and he uses it to justify his tough stance.
Saying Israel can never let its guard down.
Right. Always be ready to defend itself.
Kind of scary, actually.
It is, but is it accurate?
That's the question, right?
Yeah. Is relying so much on history dangerous? History is complicated. There are different ways to interpret it.
Right. It's not black and white.
Exactly. And Netanyahu is choosing parts of history to fit his narrative.
So we need to be careful.
We do. We can't just accept his version of history without thinking about it.
It's like he's using history to persuade us.
More than to really understand the present.
This has been really insightful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I think our listeners will get a lot out of this.
I hope so. Yeah. We've been through quite a bit.
We have, from historical claims to the two-state solution.
Right. And his focus on deterrence.
Yeah. And those alliances, especially with the U.S.
Exactly.
And I keep thinking back to how he uses history in his arguments.
He does. It's like a thread running through everything.
Yeah, like using the past to explain what's happening now.
Oh, exactly.
Last time we talked about those stories of Jewish resilience.
The Maccabees, the revolt against Rome.
Right, and he connects that to Israel's situation today.
Like they're always facing threats to their existence.
He even compares boycotts of Israel
to what happened to Jews in Nazi Germany.
Yeah, it's a strong comparison.
It is, but it also makes you think...
Like, is that really a fair comparison?
Right. Is he presenting the whole picture?
Or is he trying to avoid criticism?
And maybe even avoid responsibility for some of Israel's actions.
Because he seems to be saying that Israel can't rely on the world for fairness.
He does. He thinks the world is biased against Israel.
And holds them to a different standard.
Exactly. That comes up a lot in the book.
So for him, peace isn't about compromise or negotiation.
Not really. It's about strength and not giving in.
Like, showing any weakness just invites more aggression.
That's his view.
And never compromise security, even if it means things stay the same forever.
It's a controversial stance, for sure.
People say it won't work in the long run.
Yeah, and that it just keeps the conflict going.
So if Netanyahu doesn't believe in the traditional way of making peace...
Plan for peace?
What's his alternative?
That's the part that's really interesting and maybe a little worrying.
Okay, what is it?
He doesn't actually lay out a clear plan.
Oh?
Instead, he talks about Palestinians needing to change.
How so?
Like giving up their hope for their own state.
And accepting a kind of secondary position to Israel?
Yeah, in a region controlled by Israel.
That doesn't sound very fair.
It doesn't, and it raises some big questions about equality and respect.
Like, can you really have peace without those things?
Exactly. Netanyahu's vision seems to be about Israel staying in charge.
With Palestinians always in a weaker position.
That's how it reads, yeah, right.
But what he's saying seems like it would just lead to more conflict.
Yeah, and more inequality.
It's kind of a contradiction.
It is. He focuses on strength and security.
Which is understandable, given Israel's history.
Of course.
But it might actually make real peace impossible.
That's the key point, isn't it?
This has been a really fascinating look at Netanyahu's ideas.
Definitely complex.
It shows just how hard it is to find a way forward in this conflict.
It does, and it makes you think about what a just solution would even look like.
We hope this deep dive has given you some things to think about.
Yeah, remember, it's important to consider all sides of the story.
And to keep learning and asking questions.
The search for peace never really ends.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.